Thanks very much, Michelle, and good afternoon, everyone. It's always such a pleasure to moderate an event in this American Purpose conversation series. Just a reminder that you can find details of other forthcoming events on the website, americanpurpose.com, and that you can also subscribe to the podcast that Michelle mentioned there, Bookstack, on all the usual podcast apps. Now, today's event really is something very special. As Michelle said, it centers around a new CD by the Experimental Orchestral Laboratory PostClassical Ensemble and features a world premiere recording of Whitman. That's the 1944 radio drama by Norman Corwin, with music by Bernard Herrmann, who was also famous for his film scores, of course, including the Hitchcock films North by Northwest, Vertigo, and Psycho. I'm so pleased to welcome our guests today. It's a very distinguished panel. Murray Horwitz is a playwright, lyricist, and host of the old-time radio show, The Big Broadcast, on NPR station WAMU. Karen Karbinier is a Whitman scholar at NYU. William Sharp is a prominent American concert singer who takes the role of Whitman on the recording. And Gil-Ordóñez is musical director of the PostClassical Ensemble and the conductor of Whitman. And Joseph Horowitz is PostClassical's executive director, the producer of the recording, and an author whose books include, one of my favorites, I have to say, the seminal Understanding Toscanini, which discusses radio as a popularizing medium. So welcome to you all. We'll be discussing what this all means in context and for us today. But just before we do, let's hear a short extract from the CD of the radio drama Whitman. And I think that Michael is ready with technical wizardry.
A simple, separate person, yet utter the word democratic, the word en masse, of life immense in passion, pulse, and power. The modern man, I sing. Behold, I do not give lectures or a little charity. When I give myself. I do not ask who you are, that is not important to me. You can do nothing and be nothing but what I will enfold you. To the cotton field drudge or cleaner of privies, I lean. On his right cheek, I put the family kiss, and in my soul I swear I will never deny him. Oh, despairer, here is my neck. By God, you shall not go down. Hang your whole weight upon me. I dilate you with tremendous breath. I buoy you up. Every room of the house I do fill with an armed force.
So wonderful to hear that. And we'll be talking to Angel and to Bill, who are performing on that in a second. But Joe, let's start with you. Why did PostClassical decide to record Whitman?
I just want to credit Peter Bogdanov, who did the montage. What you heard was an excerpt from the CD. What you saw is an excerpt from a film we did concurrently called Beyond Psycho, the Musical Genius of Bernard Herrmann. And you can access that easily at www.postclassical.com. We did a Whitman festival, Richard, in 2016. Sorry, a Herrmann festival. Bernard Herrmann seems to me the most underrated 20th century American composer. We esteem him for his film scores, but he was also a memorable concert composer and the most important composer for a genre now forgotten, the radio drama. He worked both with Norman Corwin and Orson Welles. And so we just sampled what radio was like in 1944. I would say we have two topics on the table, as we've discussed, Richard. The first is, what does Whitman, what do his ideals of democracy say to us today? The other equally fascinating and maybe even more urgent, what did radio do that's no longer done? And Murray, who'll speak in a moment, summarizes that in the film by saying radio was it, by which he means this was not only the first such instant mass medium, but it was the only mass medium for a period of decades. So when Roosevelt gave a fireside chat, it centralized the American experience to the same degree that it's fragmented today. And that's what makes this topic so absolutely necessary at this moment. I just want to say two things about radio and then I'll shut up. The first, which I learned from Murray, is that when Corwin's These Truths, when We Hold These Truths was broadcast in 1941, celebrating an anniversary of the Bill of Rights, the audience was 63 million, which was nearly half the United States population. And Roosevelt and Murray can talk about the relationship between Corwin and Roosevelt, between the radio dramas and the radio and Roosevelt in a moment. But the fireside chats had an even bigger audience. And the one other thing I want to say is that when Saul Bellow was riding the rails during the Depression, he was on a slow-moving freight train. He tells this story. And the train passed a line of cars, all of which had pulled to the side of the road with the windows open. The reason they were there is that they were listening to a fireside chat. And the reason the windows were open is because it was hot. And Bellow said he didn't miss a single word.
Thanks, Joe. Well, that lays out the ground really nicely for us. We're going to come on to talking about radio and the kind of the mass appeal of radio. But let's start with Herman and with Whitman. And Gil, one of the things that I noticed in the film that accompanies the CD is that you say that Herman is a master of concision, that he's able to do a great deal in a short space of time. Can you tell us how that works and what that's like to perform?
Yeah, thank you, Richard. It's great to be with all of you here. Thank you very much. Well, I would like to maybe emphasize two aspects of the radio drama that really attracts me. One is what you said, Richard, the simplicity with very a few means creating such an universe, a very small orchestra, strings, a harp, a celesta, and then with harmonically very simple combinations of harmonies. This is the Herman sound in the radio drama. But there is something very exciting that actually Murray will talk later too about the immediacy of creating these radio dramas, which brings us a little bit to the time of Mozart and Haydn that had to write a serenade or a symphony the next week because they have a commission. And that immediacy of writing a different melodrama every week brings this spontaneity and this naturality to the piece too. So these are the two aspects that I would like to emphasize first about the radio drama.
And Bill, what's it like to play or to voice Whitman as you do in this radio drama and the CD?
It's a tremendous privilege because it gives me the opportunity and the responsibility to understand what Whitman is saying, and then to explore, the aspects of the expressive qualities, the affect of it, which a lot of that, of course, comes from Herman. This is one of the things that we tend to forget, I think, about composers for film, etc., which this is very much like film composing, I think, is that the composer is basically telling us how we feel. And so that's helpful to me as well. My first job is to understand, sometimes it's a matter of understanding the sentence structure or understanding what a word means, Every now and then there's a word and I think, I don't know what that is. But then part of the interpretive process is simply to listen to Herman's music. And Herman says, here's how, you know, when one of the portions that we think is, I think we all agree is one of the more beautiful one is the section that we refer to as the grass. And it describes a lot of wonderful natural things. And Herman is the one who really shows us this sense of wonder, because Whitman is ostensibly talking to a child, and he's sharing, you know, this childish sense of wonder about grass and bees, etc. And it's Herman who says this is the affect that we're going for. And it's also it's subconscious, I think, to a large extent. It's intended to be subconscious. You know, the music is not in the foreground. It's always cleverly, it's manipulating us, which is right. You know, as Shakespeare said, here will we sit and let the sounds of music creep in our ears. And that, in a way, that's what Herman is doing here. You know, the music is going in and manipulating the way we feel.
Yeah, Karen, I wonder, I mean, you're one of the leading Whitman scholars. Clearly, this music is interpreting Whitman. I wonder, you know, how effectively do you think that the music reflects the Whitman that you know through your scholarship? Or you're muted, Karen.
Oh, thank you. I can't believe I made that mistake. Sorry, everyone.
We all do it all the time.
Hi, Richard. Thank you so much. And hello, everybody. As far as the interpretation of Whitman, it's quite playful. I think it's evident that everyone working on this piece really knew Whitman and dabbled with Whitman quite a bit. I think Corwin, he selects various pieces of different poems and puts them together. He changes wording sometimes. So for anyone who actually knows Song of Myself or By Blue Ontario's Shore or Song of the Open Road, you're constantly surprised by the music and the lyrics, because you hear selections here and there. Corwin seems to change sometimes he to she. So there's a sense that he really regarded Whitman very highly. And I think, you know, just listening to Bill interpret those lyrics is the real power here. Whitman was a self-declared cosmos, as he said in Song of Myself. You know, he's regarded as the father of free verse, the good gray poet, as he himself said, but he's also the poet of democracy, as many people know him. And I feel like that's the Whitman that Corwin is trying to get at here with the various excerpts that he's setting.
And I suppose, Karen, because, as you say, he's often described as the poet of democracy. This is 1944, the middle of a world war. It's also an election year. There's a sense of resonance that clearly is there in 1944.
Absolutely. Whitman's years span the 19th century. He's born in 1819, dies in 1892, and he's most active and writes his best poetry in mid-century. And I think you could say that the 1850s, with the factionalism, the divisions, the pre-Civil War angst that Whitman and all Americans were experiencing is very similar to what we feel right now. And also, of course, during World War II. So Whitman is picking up, I should say Corwin is picking up on Whitman's efforts to unite Americans. There's a moment in Song of Myself, I think it's section 50, where Whitman is asking himself, there is that in me, what is it? And he says, do you see, oh my brothers and sisters, it is not chaos or death. It is form and union and plan. And I guess that effort to bring people together is something that Corwin really picks up on here with the selections that he's set.
Yeah, it's interesting, that idea of bringing people together. I mean, Joe gave us a hint of it with that Saul Bellow story earlier. Murray, I mean, sometimes it's almost impossible for us to comprehend just how universal that experience of radio was in a time like the 1940s. I mean, tell us about it.
It is unhappily almost inconceivable for many of us, particularly those of us who were born, in the 1970s, I would say, and after that, because those of us superannuated types still remember that when, for example, the President of the United States wanted to speak to the nation, he could. If you turned your channel, there were 3 or 4 stations in your neighborhood, and all of them had the president on, and all of the radio stations as well. And so it was actually possible to address the nation. Now, when the President of the United States wants to address the whole nation, he can't, because there are 200 channels, and maybe 2 or 3 of them are going to be carrying the president's speech. I think this has... I'm a disciple, I guess, aren't we all, of Whitman and of the Constitution of the United States and of Abraham Lincoln. And I think we've lost something. I think there are consequences for democracy in America when that ability to come together goes away. There's a kind of local communities too were bound together by radio. There's a sort of an analog to the Saul Bellow story that Roger Kahn tells in his book about the Brooklyn Dodgers, The Boys of Summer. And he said when the Dodgers were playing, you could walk down Eastern Parkway and listen to the game because everybody's window was open. It was the summertime, and the radios were blaring. Franklin Roosevelt, as Joe mentioned, really was the first person to exploit the new medium. It has something to do with the fact that the new medium only became the new medium in the late 1920s. The only other person who could have taken real advantage of it had been Herbert Hoover. But Roosevelt seized on it, and as I said in a different forum just last week, you could argue that Franklin Roosevelt was the biggest star in old-time radio. He grasped it, he exploited it, he used it, and when war came along, especially, I mean, before war came along, during the Depression, I think, I'm not an economic historian, but I think you could argue that there wasn't all that much progress until World War II. But he made Americans feel that something was going on, that something was being done, that we were moving forward, that we were one nation. And that stood him in very good stead in World War II. And I'll end just by saying, excuse me, that the broadcast to which Joe referred, We Hold These Truths, had been planned for a long time, and Corwin had written it, and all 4 networks were going to carry this, hence an audience of almost half the American population. There was no competition. There was no. Now you have television, you have radio, you have the internet, there are all those other mass media. This was the only one. And when the United States was attacked at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, the networks didn't know what to do. Should we go ahead with this? Should we not? And Roosevelt said, absolutely, now more than ever. And he ended up with a broadcast that I don't think, I know we'll never hear again, which was half the people in the United States listening to it.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, Murray? Because there's a paradox there, because on the one hand, radio is able to act as this great unifying force. As you say, a president can address the country. But then on the other side, obviously, there are dangers in the president effectively having the country at his beck and call. So how do you feel that Roosevelt managed to either take advantage of or navigate that particular paradox?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for not making the Nazi analogy. Hitler and Goebbels used the radio for far different purposes. Roosevelt, I think it had to do with his values. He had, and there's an analog in Corwin. Joe asked about the relationship between the two of them. I'm going to go back a little bit. Broadcasting is an agricultural term. It's a 19th century term, and it refers to a method of cultivation, which is to spread seeds broadly across a large area. And so early radio people thought of themselves as cultivators. And certainly, I'm glad you mentioned Joe's terrific Toscanini book. I mean, certainly that was what was going on there. And Roosevelt, I think, was looking at radio as a way of bringing American values up from the grassroots to be unified at the top, and at other levels in between. It's a little bit different from, the what was going on in Central Europe and Western Europe. So there are dangers, but to me, Richard, the bigger danger is what has happened to us now, which is and in fact, we use in broadcasting the term all the time, narrowcasting. So instead of e pluribus unum and one out of many, we've got exactly the opposite, where marketers and others are dividing us into ever narrower shards of demographics. And as we're learning, the one shard doesn't speak to the other and doesn't understand the other. And that's the idea of that we're all in this together, which is what Roosevelt was after, is a pretty foreign idea now.
Joe, I mean, you've written, as Murray says, in Understanding Toscanini about these kind of things. It's interesting, as he was talking there, being British, I immediately started thinking about the BBC, which still does have that kind of punch-through ability to speak pretty much to the nation. In Understanding Toscanini, you talk about the kind of battle that was going on about whether there should be an American equivalent of the BBC. Why doesn't that happen, and what kind of implications do you think came from that?
Well, as you know, I think this is a huge topic that's virtually unknown. There are two things to be said about radio in America in the 30s and 40s, a good thing and a bad thing. The good thing we just sampled, which is high ideals, culturally and intellectually, really beyond anything we've subsequently experienced, even from NPR or PBS. Just start with Bernard Herrmann, who's the conductor of the CBS Symphony, the Columbia Broadcasting System Symphony, who has studio guests like Hindemith and Bartók, who's proselytizing for Charles Ives. This is an amazing act of advocacy, and it's surrounded by things like the CBS workshop, of which Corwin is part. You've got intellectual pundits like Clifton Fadiman and William Phelps, Oscar Levant. There's just a plethora of cultural and intellectual programming that sets the bar very high. NBC, there's the NBC Symphony with Toscanini. That's an orchestra created by a commercial network, right? Even more remarkable when television comes in is the NBC Opera, which does opera in English and a lot of American opera. Imagine. This is far more ambitious than just televising something from the Metropolitan Opera. And on CBS, you've got Omnibus, you've got Leonard Bernstein with the New York Philharmonic. So these are initiatives largely by two guys, William Paley and David Sarnoff. And when they are gone, the whole house collapses. So what they did was both good and bad. The good part I just mentioned. The bad part is that they were fending off the possibility of an American BBC. This is a very explicit story. There was legislation in Congress that would have created the American equivalent of the BBC. They didn't want it. And what they created instead perhaps was just as good, but it was dependent on them. So once they're gone, you don't have anything remotely like the instrument of the BBC as an educational tool, as a tool, as you just mentioned, Richard, that could bring people together. There are many, many other nuances in this story, but those are the broad outlines. And it's a really important story right now for the reasons that Murray stated. How will we ever return to this? We have no capacity right now, even hypothetically, to bring the nation together. And P.S., culture, as we've known it, the arts. If you haven't noticed, are being erased from the American experience. So in that context, looking back at this radio drama, it's astounding. I mean, the ideals, and as Angel said, these were cooked once a week. And here in 7 days, this was created by Corwin and by Herman. This is an amazing sea change in the American experience encapsulated in this 130 minutes.
Karen, I wonder what your reflections on this kind of thing are, because, you know, yes, exactly as Joe says, that, you know, perhaps there isn't kind of somebody like Whitman is not coming forward in the traditional ways that perhaps he would have done in a kind of a radio drama and so on. And yet I'm often very struck that Whitman is somebody that still seems to have a kind of a very broad resonance, actually including with young people. Who often seem to read him and to quote him and so on. So do you think that there is a kind of a decline going on here, or is it just that the culture is evolving, the technology is evolving, and that somebody like Whitman can surf these changes over different generations?
Oh, that's such a great question and a very big one. I know certainly Whitman tried to reach a broad audience and didn't succeed in his own lifetime. He was more popular than is generally supposed, but nevertheless, it didn't really take off, the sort of Whitmania that we feel until probably the 1920s, 1930s. Langston Hughes and the Harlem Renaissance kind of latch onto Whitman as sort of like a white father figure. Allen Ginsberg, the Beat Poets, and the New York School, including Jackson Pollock, painters, musicians, artists, and then of course you get Woody Guthrie and Bob Dylan. So Whitman kind of escalates in importance in a way that now we can make sense of how he's become such a well-known voice. But I would say it's a much more current phenomenon. He tried to do it, and he thought poetry was the way. A lot of people don't know that Whitman was barely a poet before he wrote his collection, Leaves of Grass, in 1855. He was a journalist. He was a sometime short story writer, published maybe about 20 really bad rhyming poems through the 1840s. And then sometime in the 1850s, he realizes that it's going to be poetry. It's going to be poetry that speaks to the people, and that would have to be reinvented. So luckily he wrote that way, right? Or Corwin might not have picked him out as the voice of this piece. But I think we are always evolving, you know, and Whitman also goes through ups and downs of popularity. So right at that moment when this is being written during World War II, Whitman once again, you know, had become this massive voice, and there were actually distributed to soldiers these little booklets of Whitman's poetry that were designed to be portable and carried in back pockets. So it makes sense to me that Corwin saw Whitman as a resonant voice, but it also makes sense that, you know, we are kind of hopefully going in and out. I share Joe's anxieties, but I'm really hoping maybe with the vaccine and bursting out of our silent homes where we're, you know, just hibernating these months, that maybe some kind of rejuvenation of the arts actually takes place.
Come on, you're not comforting me, Karen. I feel the need to pour a little cold water on what you just said. This rediscovery of Whitman was concurrent with discovering Melville, going back to Transcendentalists. There's a huge movement, Van Wyck Brooks, Lewis Mumford, Matheson, trying to find and succeeding a usable past in American literature. And that was wonderful, but it's over. And nobody's gonna return to Moby Dick today, so far as I can see. This movement to clasp and use a usable past, of which Whitman was part. I'm sorry, I don't see anybody doing that right now. I mean, I feel the need to do it, but it feels like a very lonely exercise. You'll have to reassure me more warmly than that for me to believe that we can return to seizing our what had been our cultural roots. This is something that I'm absolutely obsessed with right now. And I don't feel comforted. I wish I did.
I'm going to give Karen the right to respond.
Yeah, go right ahead, Karen. You're very welcome to respond. Yeah.
Well, maybe I can just offer a bit of comfort here in that Whitman himself and the other poets sort of gestured outward from themselves. Whitman has poems like Poets to Come, where he actually asks for respondents. And I think that's why you get people like Ginsberg and Dylan and Tupac Shakur responding directly to Whitman. So it's not so much for Whitman anyway, it's just about being anchored in the past. It's about moving that energy to current voices also.
So Angel, correct me if I'm wrong. I believe there's not been a single review of our CD in the American press. Dozens of reviews abroad responding to Whitman. Have we had a single American writer respond to Whitman, 1944? Maybe I've missed one or two. Tell me.
Well, yeah, there were some reviews of it, but actually, you are right. It's sad to say that the most profound analysis of the radio drama come from Europe. That's a reality.
That's a weighty reality. I mean, we should think about that and ponder it. You think he's our iconic poet?
Related to that, I would like to mention something that, as a son of the generation of the Civil War in Spain, I find so many similarities to the United States. And actually, I feel one of the things that really strikes me incredibly about Whitman is that in the middle of a civil war, he's trying to unite everybody. That was not the case in Spain. We had wonderful poets during the Civil War, but they were, of course, defending their ideology. And I think that is very impressive in Whitman. And of course, talking about the Civil War, I think this is the worst thing that can happen to a country. And probably the divisions we are living nowadays, and it really is frightening to think that something that happened almost 200 years ago is still alive. And in Spain, it's also the case.
If I can jump in, Joe, to a certain extent, it's an old story. During the 20th century, many of the greatest, if not the greatest, American artists were better appreciated around the world than they were in their own country. The jazzers are a great example. The first people to really, I guess it was Ernst Ansermet, who was the first person around World War I to really take jazz seriously and say there's something going on here. He was talking about Sidney Bechet. Duke Ellington gets a posthumous Pulitzer Prize sometime in the 1980s or 90s, I think. I mean, arguably the greatest American composer of all genres. So there's always been this sort of not so much cultural illiteracy, although there's that too, but cultural lack of appreciation. And yet now people understand that Louis Armstrong is a hero, that Duke Ellington's a hero, that John Coltrane's a cultural icon. So that there's always a possibility of America's an endless set of second chances.
Joe, just for a second, I'm just going to say to everyone who's listening that if you want to put any questions or signal that you want to ask a question into the chat, we'll be able to kind of broaden out the discussion so that our guests can answer questions from people who are here. So if you can use the chat function for that, we'll be able to take those questions. Joe, I interrupted you. Why don't you
I just think you've said the same thing to me that Marie just said about your resilience, trying to reassure me of the American experience.
Yeah, I think that
from the perspective of somebody born abroad.
I think there are two aspects of that for me. I now find myself commenting rather than I'm supposed to be asking the questions. But you know, I think I'm always very struck by the resilience of American institutions. It's something that Tocqueville points to, that democracy is not just at the top level, it's something that goes down very deep. You know, even in our own local communities, we see it with the election of school boards and the kind of the way in which everything is kind of elected, and democracy is very rooted in that. And I think that, you know, in some ways that applies to culture too, as exactly as Murray said. We tend to be very nostalgic and sentimental about the things that we have grown up with. And when we see that particular age passing, that kind of fills us with a kind of a certain, well, yes, nostalgia, but also sometimes a fear that that everything is collapsing, everything is fragmenting. But I suppose that was kind of part of my reason for asking the question to Karen about the resilience of someone like Whitman for generation after generation. Murray, I mean, I wonder what, from the position as a professional broadcaster, you know, I wonder kind of what you think about, for example, that networks like CNN and Fox News and so on, which have a kind of a more populist kind of element to them, say that they are patriotic, that they are speaking to the nation. I mean, what do you make of that? It's very different to the 1940s experience, but I wonder if it's just a different way of kind of us disseminating ideas, actually closer to Madison, who did think that faction and disagreement, that these were good things that protected democracy. You're muted, Murray, sorry. We can't hear you, Murray, sorry, you're muted.
And here I'm supposed to be a professional broadcaster. The microphone is not a prop, folks. It's working.
I can't say it. That gives us all great kind of comfort that even you as a professional broadcaster occasionally do this. We all do.
But you have no idea. In those days, and that's the other thing. It's just sort of stylistically, I guess, remarkable about Corwin's Whitman and Herman's music. This was 1944. There was no audio tape. There was no digital audio. This was live. They performed this stuff live, and they came out right at the top of the hour where they're supposed to end. I mean, it was just, that's one of the many extraordinary things about it. When I started, you had mentioned Madison, and I said yes, but even Madison in Federalist 10 argues for how democracy and Republican democracy is the best way to handle factions, which he and Hamilton and Jay well understood could tear the country apart. Now you will all have the chance to talk me out of my cynicism and my despair. I think the answer is, what do I make of CNN and Fox News and these other places that pretend to a kind of populist patriotism and the phrase "the American people" is so misused. There are many, many American peoples. There's not one American people anymore, and all politicians use it. I think it's hogwash. I mean, I think it's all marketing. This is America. Follow the money, and you make more money by narrowcasting and dividing people. Dividing the American people and making them think that they are the American people than you do by actually broadcasting and actually bringing people together. Somebody tell me why I'm wrong.
Very interesting question in the chat, actually, for you, Bill. When you're performing something like this, does it actually inspire strong feelings of patriotism in you? That's a fascinating question. I'm going to be really interested to hear what the answer is.
Well, it certainly, it raises the question of who we are, who do we think we are, and who are we really? And of course, this is something that we've, I think in recent times, we've been forced to ask ourselves this too, because the question of who we are has been, and over this summer of uprising and unrest, this is a question of how we treat everybody in our community, in our culture, in our society. How do we treat Americans? And I remind myself, for one thing, that this
This is a wartime, most of what's being said in the libretto to this piece, and also the creation of the piece, is for a wartime purpose, which is to bring people together. And I think that wartime is not a time for harsh self evaluation. It's a time to bring people together. But I think what it does now for me, when I learn and interpret the things that Whitman said, I find it inspirational, but also aspirational. You know, he's saying, this is what I believe we are, and read between the lines, this is what we should be. This is what we should want to be. It isn't what we are, you know, and that's painfully clear. I mean, I have to say, you know, the pessimistic things that are being said. I don't know how many of us are teachers and who teach people in the, you know, in their 20s. But those people, and I'm a voice teacher at Peabody Conservatory of Music of Johns Hopkins University. And my students they come from all over America. It's really become quite a diverse group of people. And those people give me hope. You know, I mean, yeah, they live in a world that is very different from mine in terms of the way they perceive the way you get your information. You know, how do you know what's going on? That sort of thing. But you know, I can't be really specific about it because I haven't formulated the thoughts, but I find these young people to actually be, they fill me with hope, and their ideals would not be troublesome to Whitman. I mean, I ask myself, what would Whitman say now? What would he say about us now? And you know, I think he would have some very, very strong criticisms of American society and where we're going, but I think he would continue to be aspirational and idealistic, and he would express himself probably in a different way.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful sentiment, particularly about the optimism and hope of young people, and it ties in with Karen's point earlier that Whitman, despite the long grey beard, kind of actually seems to be a poet of the young, appeals to the young. Another really interesting question in the chat from Steve Lagerfeld. Steve, I don't know if it is quite a long question. Do you want to unmute yourself and maybe ask it to Joe yourself?
Yeah, hi. I'm not sure that I can, I'm going to unplug here. There. Okay, can you hear me? Yeah, no, I was just struck by, I shared the general pessimism about the current situation, but I was struck as you all were talking, about the state of culture and communication today, and then comparing it to the pre-war era when Roselle could get on the radio and talk to the whole nation and unite us. And yeah, that was wonderful, but that was also a moment in time. And, we were talking about Whitman, we were talking about, his being a reporter in the 40s or 50s. And, at that time, now media were different. There were actually, some forms of nascent mass media, but you couldn't easily address the whole nation at one time. You couldn't easily draw people together. The state of culture was something that elites at that time, I think, didn't, think much of. Certainly we looked to Europe much more than we do now, and we looked at our own, the forms of culture that we now sort of exalt as being kind of debased. So, this is just a kind of casual thought, but I'm just wondering, is there something that we can learn from that. And certainly, you know, I think the sort of fractionated nature of our communications, we're, you know, powerfully aware of the downside of that, but maybe there's a future in it too. I just throw it out there.
That's great, thank you. I think that's probably one for Joe or for Murray, and particularly this idea that, of course, that when Whitman was writing himself, there wasn't an easy way to address the whole nation. I think that's a really perceptive question.
I actually have a piece coming out in The American Purpose that's partly a response to the new book, The Upswing by Robert Putnam, and The New History of the United States by Gil-Ordóñez, in which I, just based on my own work as a cultural historian, mainly of the Gilded Age, talk about the bonding role of the arts in America in the late 19th century. I guess I would say it was much greater than people realize or remember. And in particular, the role of classical music as propagated by people like Theodore Thomas and Henry Higginson, who instilled the idea, as Thomas put it, that a symphony orchestra shows the culture of a community. So when Thompson is crisscrossing the United States with his Thomas Orchestra, performing Beethoven in cities large and small, this may sound very old-fashioned, but it worked. And it was bonding. The Wagnerism movement, which I've written about in the 1880s and 1890s, which pervaded not only the arts, but the entire intellectual life of the United States, it's not as elitist as you might imagine. It's for one thing, it empowers women to a remarkable degree. This isn't a direct response to Steve's interesting comment. It's just more something that's on my mind that you made me think about, which is the arts were bonding for Americans before World War I to an inordinate degree. And we don't talk about the arts today when we talk about what's wrong with America. You won't find it in Putnam's books. When he talks about the lack of social cohesion and what to do about it, he doesn't look to the arts at all.
Richard, if I could just jump in, because I'm very interested in what Steve said about actually, you know, just going from what Steve said, that Whitman, who was a journalist, didn't use journalism to get the word out on, you know, the ideas that he had, this big democratic vision that he had for America. There were so many penny dailies in New York. That's so true. Journalism was fragmented. There were great orators of the time, right? And Whitman actually thought about becoming an orator and wrote notes about that. But the fact that he chose poetry, and then he had to actually reinvent it, right? Because even though he may have had some models for what he was thinking, Emerson comes to mind here. He saw them as deficient, right? And created free verse. He's also, as I said, known as the father of free verse. So it seems to me that Whitman also struggled mightily with figuring out how to reach the American public, and ultimately decided that he had to create his own vision of the way that he would communicate to everyone.
And Murray, I think you looked as if you were about to jump in there as well.
Man, I always look like I'm about to say something, because I usually am, even if I don't know what I'm talking about. No, in this case, I wanted to bring it a little bit back to Corwin, because I can't add anything to what, all I'll say to what Karen just said is that's what's amazingly, to me, what's extraordinary about, one of the extraordinary things about Whitman is that he had this vision of the country at a time when there really was no means to reach everybody that way. But yet, boy, did he strike a chord in every village and hamlet and big city. And I can't add anything to what I just want to pile on to what Joe said, because opera, there's some great stories about Eugenie Sailly going out west and playing in these Wild West towns. I mean, there was no high and low. in the way we think of it today. That happened later as a way of expropriating high culture for a group of people to say we're better than those people there, which is something we Americans love to do a lot. I'm sorry, I'm sounding so awful and pessimistic. But to bring it back to Corwin, if you listen to a lot of Corwin broadcasts, and it's important to remember Corwin lived to be 100, and Corwin was producing radio into this century. I was at NPR and actually sort of was the executive in charge when a wonderful producer, Mary Beth Kirshner, sort of found him, and we aired Corwin dramas pieces in the first decade of this century, and before that in the 90s as well. But if you listen to a lot of Corwin, some of it is, nobody talks like that anymore. Nobody writes like that. What you hear in the CD with Angel's amazing, or I keep saying amazing, but his just the post-classical ensemble is just a great chamber orchestra, and in Bill's very, very wonderful performance is Corwin at his best, because as Joe has pointed out, Corwin was influenced by three writers especially: Carl Sandburg, Thomas Wolfe, and Walt Whitman. Joe and I are of one mind in Thomas Wolfe's unreadable now. I mean, when I was in school, everybody said, oh man, Thomas Wolfe in the 1950s and 60s. Nobody reads Wolfe now, and with good reason. Sandburg, yeah, okay, but Whitman, he had the best to work with when it came to Whitman. And I always use the word stentorian when I'm talking. There's just this overarching, overweening kind of prose that Corwin was fond of writing, and he gives the stage to Whitman in this piece. And thank God he does, because it makes it all the more powerful. And Herman's music Joe would certainly know, Angel would know, I think he probably wrote for radio more than he wrote certainly more than the concert stage, but even more for movies than for movies. He wrote a score every week, as Joe pointed out. There is Bach, who was writing a cantata every week, but then, as Wynton Marsalis always says, Bach wasn't human. The idea that he was writing these extraordinarily subtle and nuanced scores, and thanks to Angel and Joe, we can actually hear it. Because in those days, you heard it over a little speaker that was that big, and it was in monophonic sound, and it sounded very tinny. Now you hear it in full fidelity and a great performance, and it's remarkable.
And we're almost out of time now, but Angel, that links really nicely back to you. I mean, can you just tell us a bit more about the kind of sense in which you think that the arts and music in particular can be unifying, particularly at times of not just national, but also global crisis, such as the one that we're living through right now?
Yeah, well, it sounds a little stereotype, but everybody loves music. I mean, how can you not be moved by music? Actually, post-classical ensemble is a true believer in that. And actually, we are a reaction to, the problem is not the music, the problem is how you present the music. And we are actually obsessed, as Joe said, we're kind of advocates of lost causes, and the idea of sense of occasion, surprise. So this is the reason is, this of experimenting and discovering. And this unites everybody. I mean, I can tell you that when we had Bill and the orchestra in the cathedral doing Whitman live, it was an incredible experience. Imagine this in the Washington National Cathedral, just the space. Of course, it's the way to go. And as Joe said, it's the arts where we need to be focused right now.
That's exactly the note of uplift on which I want to close things. That's wonderful, Angel, because sadly we're just about out of time. The CD is Whitman and Other Works by Bernard Herrmann. It's played by the Post-Classical Ensemble, conducted by Angel, and it's available on the Naxos label. You can find more details about it, plus the film that Joe mentioned, on the PostClassical website, postclassical.com. And of course, don't forget to check out our own website, americanpurpose.com. But for now, Murray, Karen, Angel, Bill, Joe, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a wonderful discussion about a wonderful CD performance. So with that, I'll hand back to Michelle to make the final thanks.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Richard. Beautiful job. Our guests, it was just a delight to listen to you speak. And I'm sure we could go on and we would all enjoy it. Just the topics lend themselves to so many interesting discussions. And thank you for drawing out so many different threads and for the questions we had as well. Thanks, everybody.